think part of the problem that we have with the introduction is that we are repeatedly exposed to what a good introduction is supposed to look like. We are told what good elements an introduction will have, but we are not so much taught about the processes that lead to that good introduction. So it's one of the things that is going to take up a significant amount of your time during the writing. And these are the things that I will try to uncover as we go through this session. What I will try to do is, first of all, talk more generally about why we write. So we are not just writing so that somebody can mark or assess our work. There's actually a reason behind writing, especially when you're doing it in an academic way. It's important to note that it's a very involved process. So it's not just about presenting something and then there it is, but there's actually a lot of work that goes into producing, let's say, an 8,000 word manuscript, as most journals would ask for in the things that we have. Then I will get to the specifics of the introduction itself. What sort of things should you be thinking about? How should you approach it? And then within this session, I'm going to get you started on an introduction. We know from the sign-ups that some people are working on PhDs, some people are working on papers, some people want to see what the heck is going on. I think there will be a bit of something for everyone. I'm just going to ask you to humor me. So even if what I'm asking you to do sounds ridiculous, just do it anyway, and then we will see where it's going to take us. There are a lot of misconceptions that we have about academic writing, and these misconceptions, I think, start very early on, and we take them with us into our adult life. And these misconceptions, I think, for most of the part, have guided our writing and have become the source of frustration and being stuck when it comes to writing. So there are three main things that I want to point out that I see as common mistakes that I was also a victim to a long time ago, and I see them repeatedly, especially when I engage with students. So a lot of us think that writing is about having some specific ideas in your mind, and then when you have sorted out those ideas, you are going to write what you have figured out. So we see writing as a tool for conveying the things that are in our minds. We also think that writing is a linear process. So if you are asked to do a dissertation or write a manuscript, most people are going to then think, okay, so I will write the introduction, go to the literature review, go through all these phases until I get to the discussion and conclusion. And then the final thing that is also quite problematic is that we see it as a sales pitch. We see that whatever we produce as an output is something that we are selling to an audience. So we have to persuade them with all manner of tactics that this is really something that is worth reading. But this is not how it works. And if you have held on to any of these three beliefs at any point in your time, in your life, I would say this is the time to let them go. This is the time to unlearn it, because it's going to be disastrous in terms of your progress as an academic writer, especially. So what is writing? I touched on this when we did the session that I did for WIC. And the idea is that whatever you have in your mind right now, whether it's a specific topic or paper that you want to write, it's a tangled mess. It's nothing that you can actually clarify by just sitting and thinking about it repeatedly, because sometimes you even have what they call Zizek, this philosopher talks about knowledge that doesn't know itself. There are things you know that you don't realize you know, and there are things you don't know that you may not realize you don't know. So there's so much going on in the mind that it's impossible that you will think things through and then write them out. So what we do with writing, I like this image because it shows like how it's the idea that you pull out the tangled mess that's in your brain, you put it out in a physical space that you can then actually start to go through the process of interrogating, of sorting through, of deciding what works and what doesn't, of figuring out what you don't know, what you might need to know, even figuring out what you already know that you didn't realize you know. So writing in itself is actually thinking. There is no way that you can separate the two. The two belong together. So instead of thinking that you are supposed to write what you think, you have to understand that writing is the process through which you think, and it's an effective process because it allows you to draw out this tangled mess and for you to be able to then look at it in a way that's going to help you to sort through the ideas and get to something that becomes a bit more tangible and accessible to others as well. And there's also this distinction which has created the problems as well, right? So we think of writing as a linear process, probably because this is how our readers read, or at least we think that our readers read that like that. But I think most expert readers will probably read an abstract, then go to an introduction, then go to the discussion, and then check everything else out. Although what we produce as the output usually looks like this, the actual process of writing itself doesn't work like that. So if you have been writing your papers in a structured way and have found that things have been taking longer and you have been getting frustrated as you get to later ends because you had, for example, the perfect theory section that you now have to undo, it's probably because you have been trying to write in a linear way. The reality of writing is that at a certain point, if you will do it right, you don't even know where you started. You will keep going back to the same places and you will have to move back and forth. Sometimes you will even go out of scope and you'll have to drag yourself back. But this is you thinking and sorting through the tangled mess, leading to this tiny, very neat piece of work that the reader is actually going to access. So our writing processes are very different from what we produce as the final output. And as a result, then we have to think about what are the different things that we have to engage with in the different stages of our writing. And so why do we write? In the end, I think there are two things. One relates to yourself as the writer, and the other relates to the audience that you are writing for. So for yourself, you would like to increase your clarity in thinking. You would like to be able to interrogate yourself. If you have started with what you thought was a problem, you want to be sure, is it really a problem? If you made the claim that it hasn't been done before, you would like to be sure that it hasn't been done before. Sometimes you even need to figure out what the problem is that you need to solve, but you have to have that clarity for yourself in thought. And then when you have achieved this clarity in thought for your audience, what you need is precision and expression. So your language should not be fluffy. It shouldn't be open to interpretation. Your audience should get right away what you are saying. And so what this means in the end, if you would actually be the writer that focuses on yourself to gain the clarity in thinking in terms of the problem that is in front of you, and you would be able in turn to express this in a very precise way to your readers. This is how novelty would be created. So you don't just get a novel idea and it's sitting there, but it's part of a really involved process. You get the transparency because your readers are not necessarily interested in what you know. They are interested in how you came about to know the things that you are presenting to them. And then maybe you will have the wow effect, who knows? But I see a lot of papers, for example, that give guidance on writing, and they say the role of your introduction is to captivate the attention of the reader. It sounds a lot like a sales pitch, but what I would like to argue is that this only becomes a natural consequence of doing the right things on the back end of the process. So you don't just magically have the introduction that's going to captivate the reader, but the clearer your thinking on the problem and the more precise your expression in relation to that problem, then the higher the chances that there will be something that your readers are going to appreciate and that is going to actually get their attention. Without the clarity of thought and without the precision of expression, you are not going to captivate your audiences. You are not going to grab their attention in the way that you intend. So it's important to understand the problem with which you're engaging for yourself. And it's also important to be able to express it clearly once it becomes also obvious to you. So all this means is that writing is an extremely involved process. So one of the things that I find very interesting, especially now in the era of AI use, is that academics are probably one of the people in the fields where we seem to want to do less of what it actually takes for us to be who we are. If an athlete is involved in a sport, whether they're swimming or running or playing tennis, whatever they're doing, they will repeatedly engage in that task. Every day, they will overexert themselves. They will fully apply themselves to get to the point where they are actually able to stand out from everyone else. And I think the same applies for academic writing. It's really not different at all. If you are going to be the writer that has clarity of thought and that is really good at conveying those thoughts, then you are going to have to put a lot of time into writing, because that is what defines or what makes us stand apart from everyone else. So it's not different from everything else. So I had an example that I pulled out. This is a paper that I wrote, which was accepted in 2016. It's one of the top journals in my field. And what I was looking at was the history of this paper. So one of the things that you will see is that this was a folder that was dedicated to the entire paper. And there are about 176 items there. And all these items are actually documents. There might be Excel files where I did the analysis. There might be different versions of the paper, but this is what I was actually doing the entire time. And you will see that introduction appears a lot. So when I try to filter it out, this is what came out. I have, out of 176 items, 50 items with the word introduction in at least the title, right? So that means that for more than 1/3 of the time, or just under 1/3 of the time, I actually was doing something in the introduction. In the end, the introduction is going to be a very small part of your entire manuscript. Maybe it's going to be 700 to 1,000 words, depending on which journal you're targeting, about 10% of the total word count. But I had to spend so much time on the introduction and doing the different things that were related to it. So what are the things that you will need to realize when it comes to this? Well, the first thing is that, as I said, writing is thinking. So you have to get in the habit of writing a lot. You have to be comfortable with having dozens of drafts for a single section, because that is how you gain that clarity of thought. You also have to be comfortable with the idea that a lot of the things that you will generate at first are likely going to be shitty. They will be horrible, but this is you putting out this tangled mess and then going about the process of sorting through it. So be comfortable with that imperfection, because it's the starting point. And then next to writing, I think it's also important that you try to speak about your writing. Sometimes you realize the flaws in your thinking when you actually start speaking about what you do, rather than just writing and reading it. So this is where presentations become important, whether you are doing seminars or attending conferences, this helps. And then having a social element to it, especially, at least in as far as it relates to women. We are very social people, and we do things much better in a communal way than individually. So rather than write in isolation, try to socialize. And this is part of the reason that we actually have the writing sessions within SWAN, where we try to get things done. So what are we supposed to be doing then? Where's the starting point? If you have to write an introduction that you have been avoiding, this is probably what is in front of you. You have had this document for a while, and you're just looking into nothingness, and it's not clear what you have to do. So how do you get started, at least in terms of the introduction? So it can be a good point to start. I think as I started by preempting the story of this person who had 5 papers and no introductions for all of them. It's not the starting point for everyone, but I have found it to be a very useful starting point, especially when you collaborate with other people. And these are the things that I have been able to do that are helpful. So when you have to write your introduction, your first focus is in increasing the clarity of your own thinking. It's in you having some kind of clarity in terms of what the problem is that you are looking at, and what sort of things you have to do in order to be working towards a draft that you will be able to present to an outside audience, and they're going to get it. They're going to get what you are trying to present. So if you are going to write an introduction in the very first instance, there will be things that will stay in the introduction throughout the process. So an introduction should already make it clear what the problem is that you're trying to unpack. But the process of arriving at the problem that you can present to an outside audience is much more involved. You have to be able to specify, why is it important? Why should we care about this problem? You know, does it matter in the grand scheme of things? And why would anyone but me, you know, sometimes there are things we need to understand for ourselves. Like maybe, why doesn't my spouse give me so much attention? We can see why it's important for you, but it might not be important for everyone else. So you're writing for an audience that will have to also take an interest in the thing that you are trying to understand. So that's one of the things that you have to do. Then, in order for you to do this right, you also have to have an idea of what's currently understood about the problem and what's the significance of this. So some knowledge sometimes already goes a long way in terms of giving us a good foundation on which to build on. And sometimes the knowledge that we have probably overlooks certain things. So it has blind spots that you might want to exploit. So just taking the time to consider what is currently understood is one of the ways that helps you to see if you're going to build on an already well-established knowledge base, or if you're going to shine the spotlight on a blind spot of that knowledge base. And such things help you to determine, for example, so am I going to do an exploratory type of research where I'm really probably building everything from almost scratch? Or am I going to look at something that's already well known and I'm trying to refine it? And all those things have to be clear to you first before you can tell a reader what you're going to do. Then there's the problem, that's one thing, but you also then have to talk about what question are you asking in relation to this problem. So based on the gap that you have identified, the current knowledge that we have, what question are you asking? And how far should you go? So what's the scope within which you're going to look at the problem? So some problems are too big. There's no way that you can address them in a single piece of work. So if you're producing, let's say, an article for a journal, you would normally have to make the question much more focused than the problem is big. Then you have to think about what's the best way to go about the problem. So what are the methods that you are going to employ in order to address this problem? And this is something that people are fussy about because normally they don't care what you find out. I think in an academic setting, we are always interested in how did you come to know this? So we have to be able to audit your processes. If you have some kind of cookbook, we have to know what were the ingredients that you actually used and what were the processes or steps that you took leading to the outcome that you present. So the methods are important and they're fundamental, and they always have to be at the forefront of your considerations in terms of what you are going to do. And then finally, you have to be able to say, what contribution will I make by addressing this problem? How will the world be better off for knowing this problem or understanding this problem in the way that I have been able to capture? So normally we'll think about this in terms of a specific scientific community. So why would the people in your community care about what you have found out? And then these days, increasingly, especially with funding agencies, they want to know what does society benefit from this, or what do practitioners actually get out of this. So more and more, we are having to make dual contributions to please the scientific audience and to also please the, let's call them, general audience. What also is important, I think, at this stage when you are trying to get clarity for yourself, sometimes it helps to also think about what your research will not address. So although the problem might be specified in a general way, the question might be specific to the point that there are certain things about the problem you will not necessarily tackle. So having that understanding for yourself, I think, helps, especially when you go into your data collection process, when you think about What sort of protocols am I going to design? What kind of data am I going to collect? So this clarity of what you will not be doing is important. That's one thing. But then there's also the clarity on, at the end of the process, what may I not know, or what will I not know? Because all these things are going to contribute to how you are going to think about your writing. So at the moment, the things that I have presented are about writing for yourself. So you increase the clarity in thinking by asking yourself these questions and starting from a point where you say, if the world was perfect and I had no limitations, what will be the type of problem that I'm looking at? How would I go about trying to solve it? How would I build on existing knowledge or create new knowledge streams that are going to be helpful for this? But this is for you first, before you do it for the external audience. I don't think that you will ever experience anything as weird as trying to communicate something you don't understand to other people. And when you don't understand it yourself, it also becomes apparent to those people that you don't understand it, because they will not get it and they will be asking questions that you're not able to address. So this clarity for yourself is important, and it's a critical starting point then in terms of you writing your introduction. But at the same time, even if you are trying to gain this clarity for yourself, you have to have the audience at the back of your mind. So these things are all the things that, let's say, the reviewers are going to be interested in, or the audience that you're writing for is going to be interested in. They will want to know how what you're doing is different from what's already out there. They will want to know specifically what it is that you're interested in, how you went about coming to the solution, and therefore how they are better off having spent some time in their life reading your piece of work, right? So in the end, once you get this clarity for yourself, inward looking first, that's going to help you to increase the precision of expression. So looking outwards towards your readership and trying to get them to do things. So these are the things that I think are important in terms of the introduction, but I think I will stop here and ask for people who have been looking at this vast emptiness, how come you haven't started writing? What do you think has been holding you back? Why does your document still look like this? So if you think you have a problem with time, I have good news for you. I'm going to give you something like 20 minutes to actually write something today. And we will see where this 20 minutes takes you. If you think you need to know everything, well, let's see what you are able to write without knowing everything. So we are going to start writing an introduction. And I would say right now, without being obsessed about the order of things and without thinking too much about whether it's perfect or not, can you just try to map out what sort of problem you are looking at, why this problem is important to a broader audience, what you think is currently known about the problem, and what sort of question you should be asking. Then think about the methods that you will have to use to address this question and what you think the contribution will be. So none of these things are going to be perfect now, and they're not going to be clear now, because gaining that clarity is a process that takes much, much longer, and I will get back to it later. So how do you proceed? The very first draft of the introduction is for yourself. So it's for the things that I have just explained. You need to have the clarity in yourself before you can convince someone else that there's something valuable in what you have done. So as I already said, they are fundamentals. You have to capture the problem. You have to determine the scope within which you're going to look at this problem. For example, in my field, we study supply chains, and we say, okay, do I focus on an organization? Do I focus on the organization and the customer? Do I also add another supplier and another supplier? But those things are usually very important considerations that we have to make and approach. How will I do it? So is it an ethnographic study? Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? Does this approach actually fit the problem that I'm trying to address? Because if it doesn't, I have to make sure that these are aligned. And ultimately, what's the contribution? What will make someone else interested in picking up this piece of work and reading about it? So at this stage, your focus is also capturing what you think you know. because you cannot possibly know everything. So you might think you know the gap that is in the literature. You might think you know what the actual problem is, looking at the context, but it might also help you to realize what you actually don't know. So if you were writing this introduction and you were thinking, I'm not sure if this is actually true, so you mark it. So that's one of the things that you have to do, because if it was that important that it made it in your introduction, then you have to be sure that this is true. So it means that you might even want to say, can I disconfirm the things that I think are true? Anything you state as fact, highlight it and try to find the literature that disconfirms it, not the literature that confirms it, because this is the way that you begin to be critical with yourself and you begin to actually build on existing knowledge. And once you do this, when you capture what you think you know and you realize what you don't know, it also helps to narrow the scope of your literature search. It's going to help you, instead of going into this vastness of thousands of papers, you might actually be able to say, no, these are my keywords. These are the key things I need to find in the literature. And then that gives scope in terms of the literature that you're going to find. But after this, you will probably, for this very first draft, you will need 2 or 3 rounds before you're reasonably satisfied, maybe more if you're a perfectionist or it's a harder problem than you thought. But then after this, you will have to capture other considerations. So I've mentioned the practical aspect. If you don't have the resources for an ethnographic study, or you don't have the time for it because it's your master's dissertation, then obviously that becomes out of the question. Then you have to ask, does the question actually fit the methods that are available to me? That's one thing you can do. You also have to think about what you find in the literature. That might mean you have to revise your claims. If you say, this has never been done before, and you find that they've actually done it, maybe you have to specify how they have done it and what you add with the approach that you're going to take. But you're actively trying to make sure that you are self-critical, because this is what will come back when other people read your work. So if you do your homework right in these early phases, then you will face less criticism from the outsiders. Think about what's feasible versus desirable. So usually your first draft is like, I'm thinking of an ideal world where I care about the fundamentals of research and I'm asking the right questions and I'm following all the right approaches. Now take that and audit it and think about all the other things you have to think about, the practical considerations, what's already existing out there in the literature, what your data reveals. Sometimes your data tells you things that you didn't expect to find. And then that might mean that, okay, so what was desirable is no longer possible, but this is what is feasible, and this is what I will have to work with. And then your clarity now is really focused on the feasible space of your whole idea. It's going to narrow probably your research questions, it will narrow your scope, but it will make it become more focused. And this also makes it easier than digging further into the literature. And then the final draft, this is what you write for your audience. So this is the introduction that we all get to see. As I showed you in my process for the paper that I got in 2016, I had 50 versions out of 176 documents that were actually based on, that had some interaction with the introduction in a serious way. So after 50 plus iterations, I end up with the introduction that is fit for the audience. So what does the audience care about? My arguments have to be in the right order. I have to start with the big things that are going to maybe get their attention, and then I will have to break them down in ways that they can see how I am building the problem, right? And then that's when you can also obsess over the word choice. Is this the right word? Does it precisely describe what I would like to describe? Because if it doesn't, I might have a problem that they don't understand me. But once you pick the right keywords, those keywords have to be used consistently throughout your manuscript. They have to outlive the introduction. And then your final draft of the introduction also only focuses on the big picture. Whereas when you write the introduction for yourself, certain details are very, very important. Like, okay, why am I using this approach? What sort of methods am I going to, what sort of data tools and analysis am I going to follow? Once you write the introduction for an external audience, you want to make the introduction about the big picture. So what's the main problem? What's the general methods that you will use? What's the contribution in a very general sense without getting into the details of the findings? And then the precision of expression. This is so important. And as I already said, it's in the language. It has to be simple and accessible. It has to be clear. It has to be less open to interpretation. Your logic should be visible to the reader. They should see how you are thinking, how you are building your arguments, how you are combining different ideas to make something that takes you forward or takes them forward on your journey of discovery. So the final draft that you usually see, that we all try to write, is your end point. If you will start with the kind of introduction that you see published in many places, you're going to have a very hard time with your writing in general. And this is why the idea that the perfection versus the progress is a very important dichotomy to think about at the back of your mind. So there are these things that I think are very important that relate to writing. So one relates to perfectionism, because we all suffer that if we're academics. This is about the shitty first draft, just being comfortable with the mess that you put out on the first draft that you won't let even your supervisor see. You'll kill anyone who tries to get to it. But how do you move then from that draft? Why is it such an important document to generate, leading to what becomes your ultimate masterpiece? How you develop a daily writing practice. So other people have already talked about how difficult it is to write in isolation. So find buddies that you will write with, that you will hold each other accountable in terms of this. Think about the Pomodoro technique. It allows you to break down your task into 25-minute chunks. This helped me a lot. I used to think I need to sit down for 4 or 6 hours and write. And I thought Pomodoro is ridiculous, but I'm a big fan now. I write 25 minutes, I take a break. Even just walking around the block, it helps me to make leaps in my thinking that allow me to write better when I get back to it. And there's this lady who talked about writing more efficiently, and she went from writing 2,000 words a day to 10,000 words a day. Unfortunately, if you're academic, you will never write like this. Otherwise, we will be churning out a single article every day. So this is not for us, but there are a lot of principles that she discusses there in her fiction writing, science fiction, that I think are also valuable for us, how you create the scripts that help you to structure your writing a bit more and organize yourself a bit better in order to make the progress that you would like to see. So even though we count words, I think most times you can write more than 2,000 words a day, but you might actually lose half of them when you start to go about sorting your ideas and scoping it and ordering it, and that's perfectly fine. So you will write a lot of words and lose a lot of words on your journey to clarity. This is inevitable, and I think it's actually necessary.